She sat with the message still open on her phone, reading it a second time like the words might change. They didn't. So, it turned out you guys were right all along. That was the sentence she typed to a room full of strangers online, because she couldn't say it out loud to anyone who actually knew her yet. Not out loud. Not to him. Because the truth underneath it was simpler, and it was the kind of simple that breaks something open. He doesn't love me. And the thing that finally got her there wasn't a fight. It wasn't a confession. It was something much smaller. A woman from his past reaching out again, and him choosing, one more time, to say nothing. Before any of this, they were just friends. Years of it. The kind of friendship that doesn't announce itself as anything more, right up until it does. She'd known him long enough to have a whole history that predated any of the tension that was coming. Inside jokes, mutual friends, the comfortable shorthand of two people who'd never had to try very hard with each other. Then, one evening, it shifted. Wine, quiet conversation, the kind of closeness that sneaks up on two people who've spent years pretending it wasn't there. They ended up wrapped around each other on the couch, and for a few hours, it felt inevitable, like something that had been waiting for permission. The next morning, he panicked. He told her he wasn't over his ex-fiancée. Not exactly, he'd clarify later. He wasn't saying he wanted her back. He was saying that watching a decade-long friendship turn into something else, overnight, terrified him. If it went wrong, he'd lose her twice. Once as a girlfriend, and once as the friend she'd been for years before that. She heard him out. She stayed. What she was staying for was this. 9 years. 9 years he'd spent with the woman before her ended 9 months earlier, and, by his account, ended gently. No cheating, no blow-up. Just two people who'd quietly stopped being right for each other and decided to be kind about it on the way out. Kind endings, she'd learn, don't always mean finished endings. She didn't know yet that friendly breakup and closed chapter were two very different things, and that she was about to spend the next year learning exactly how different. The first time she walked into his apartment as more than a friend, she noticed the little things before she understood what they meant. The smart speaker on his kitchen counter still greeted him using his ex's name. Not his ex-fiancée as a categorical presence, her actual name, programmed in, unchanged. One of his other devices still displayed her name in the settings, like a placeholder nobody had thought to erase. And on a shelf, in plain view, sat a piece of handmade pottery, something the ex had made herself, signed, sitting in their shared line of sight every time either of them walked past it. She told him it made her uncomfortable. He nodded, said he understood, and for a long stretch of time, nothing changed. The speaker kept using the name. The pottery stayed on the shelf. It wasn't just the objects, it was the stories. Anytime something in daily life reminded him of a memory, the memory that came out belonged to her. A restaurant they used to go to, a trip she'd mentioned once, a joke only the two of them would have understood, small anecdotes, constantly, until one evening she finally said it out loud, flat and a little too honest. I feel like I know her better than my mother, and I'd prefer not to. He laughed it off. She didn't. A few weeks into dating, he told her he'd arranged to meet his ex for coffee. Just to catch up, he said. Just to tell her, in person, that he was seeing someone. When he told his ex about the new relationship, her response wasn't warmth. It wasn't indifference either. I need some time to process that. Not the reaction of someone who'd fully let go. And not long before that meeting, the ex had reached out on her own to let him know she'd been invited to a wedding and that she was bringing a male friend as her +1. She said she wanted him to hear it from her directly so he wouldn't feel blindsided if he heard it secondhand. What she didn't say, carefully, deliberately, was whether that man was actually more than a friend. It was a strange kind of consideration, the kind that only makes sense if you still care, quite a lot, about how the other person feels. She noticed. She filed it away. She told herself it was nothing. It was the first of many somethings she'd tell herself were nothing. There was a private travel journal the two of them, him and his ex, had kept during their relationship. Not a public platform. No audience, no followers to speak of beyond each other and a handful of family. After the breakup, she kept posting there. Solo trips, life continuing. He kept following it. Every morning, she'd notice him checking it. A quiet little ritual before coffee, before anything else, scrolling through his ex's most recent updates like part of him hadn't quite closed that tab. She told him it wasn't appropriate. He agreed. He unfollowed. Then came their first vacation together, a trip that was supposed to be theirs, just theirs. And somewhere in the middle of it, without telling her, he quietly followed his ex's travel journal again. She found out. There was a fight, a real one this time, not a passing comment over dinner. He unfollowed again. And his ex, learning what had happened, reached out on her own to say she'd unfollow him too. Like she understood, better than he did in that moment, what the boundary was supposed to look like. Why does she have to be the one who figures out the boundary before you do? That was the question that sat in the room and never quite got answered. It didn't stop there. He wished his ex a happy birthday. He asked about her latest trip. Small gestures, each one defensible on its own, were friendly, that's all, and each one landing on top of the last until the pile was too tall to explain away. Eventually, they met up one more time to divide what was left from their old shared apartment. Mostly it was the pottery, the piece she'd already left behind once. In her boyfriend's girlfriend's eyes, there had been other options. He could have kept it, given it away, let it go the way she'd already let it go by leaving it there in the first place. He gave it back. None of these moments, taken alone, would have been a deal breaker. That was what made it so hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through the accumulation of it. A checked-in social media account here, a returned birthday message there, a small kindness at a time, each one small enough to justify, all of them adding up to something that felt, increasingly, like unfinished business wearing the costume of friendship. When he asked her to move in together, she said yes. They found a place. It felt, for a while, like forward motion. Before the move, he told her he'd deleted every remaining photo of his ex from his phone. A clean slate, he said. A closed door. It wasn't true. She found that out only after they'd already signed the lease, already carried boxes into a home that was supposed to be entirely theirs. Around the same time, she discovered he'd also been in contact with his ex again, this time about something related to their old, shared apartment. Nothing scandalous on its face, just one more thing he hadn't mentioned. Then came the group photo. Tucked inside a stack of old birthday cards, she found a printed picture. Him, his ex, two mutual friends, some old gathering neither of them had spoken about. It was exactly the kind of thing they'd agreed, explicitly, wouldn't have a place in their new home. No photos of past partners. That had been the deal. She didn't confront him. She was tired. Tired of being the one who kept having to find out instead of being told. So she threw it away, quietly, and said nothing. She knows that wasn't the healthiest way to handle it. She's not proud of it. But by then, honesty had started to feel like something only she was responsible for keeping. Still, there was one bright spot. Their old landlord asked for confirmation from his ex before releasing a joint rental deposit. Instead of reaching out to her, he tracked down the original paperwork himself and proved it wasn't necessary. No contact required. A small thing, but a real one. Proof, she thought, that he could choose the boundary without being pushed into it. For a moment, she let herself believe that meant progress. When she shared her story online, the responses came fast, and they didn't all agree, but a pattern of their own started to form. One commenter didn't mince words. 9 years doesn't dissolve in 9 months just because the breakup was polite. In their view, he hadn't closed that chapter. He'd just changed which room he was reading it in. Another pushed back gently on her own self-doubt, pointing out that she wasn't imagining a pattern out of jealousy. She was naming one, accurately, after watching it repeat for a year. A third brought up the ex herself, noting that a woman who tells her former partner's new girlfriend, "I need time to process that," and who carefully dodges questions about her own dating life, isn't exactly modeling closure either. Two people who'd never fully let each other go, in their reading, regardless of what either of them called it. Someone else played devil's advocate, suggesting that blended histories are messy by nature, and that deleting every trace of a 9-year relationship overnight isn't realistic for anyone, that some of this might be clumsy transition rather than deliberate deception. And one comment zeroed in on the thrown-away photo, not to criticize her, but to point out that the fact she'd reached the point of quietly disposing of evidence rather than raising it directly was itself a red flag about where the relationship's communication had landed. Nobody in the comments thought she was the problem. Where they differed was on whether he even knew he was one. She didn't have much to add in the way of a direct reply. No dramatic new revelation, no twist she was sitting on. Just an edit, clarifying the timeline. They'd moved in together in April, and as far as she knew, contact with his ex had stopped from that point on. For a while, she let herself believe that. Genuinely believe it. Not because he'd promised anything new, but because the silence itself felt like proof. No birthday messages, no early morning check-ins on an old travel journal, no unexplained contact about the old apartment. Months went by. The relationship, on the surface, looked steadier than it had in a long time. Then, without warning, the silence broke. His ex reached out again, first time in months. Nothing dramatic on paper. Just a life update. She'd moved apartments, and she happened to now be living within the same city they shared. Not urgent information, not anything that needed to reach him at all, really, let alone right away. He wrote her back. And once again, for what felt like the 100th quiet variation of the exact same moment, he didn't mention it. She didn't hear it from him. She found out the way she always found out. Instead of telling me, or just ignoring her, he wrote her back and didn't tell me again. That was the moment something finally settled in her chest. Not shock, not even anger exactly. Something closer to clarity. The landlord moment, the paperwork, the one time he'd chosen the boundary on his own. She'd let herself build a whole narrative of progress on top of that single data point. And here was the pattern, reasserting itself, plain as ever. She wasn't dealing with someone who occasionally slipped. She was dealing with someone whose default setting, whenever his ex resurfaced, was silence and contact. In that order, no matter how many conversations, fights, or unfollow-refollow cycles came before it. If any part of you has been sitting with a version of this, the small dishonesties that pile up faster than the big ones ever could, it might be worth hitting subscribe, because these are exactly the kinds of stories this channel exists to sit with, honestly, without rushing past the hard parts. She didn't need a bigger confession than this. This was already enough. There's a real difference between someone who's slow to let go of their past and someone who is never actually planning to. The first kind stumbles. They forget to delete a photo, they're clumsy about boundaries early on, but over time, the trend line moves in one direction, toward honesty, toward you. The second kind gives you just enough progress to keep you patient. A boundary held here, a deposit handled without drama there, small proofs of concept offered up right when you're about to stop believing. And then, when it matters least and would cost the most to hide, the old pattern resurfaces anyway. She spent a year trying to tell the difference between the two. In the end, the answer wasn't in any single incident, the pottery, the photo, the coffee meetup. It was in what he did the one time it truly didn't matter, when nobody would have noticed either way. He chose silence again. So here's the question worth sitting with. Whichever side of this you've been on, how many small honesties does someone have to fail before you stop counting it as one pattern and start calling it their character?